Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chaplain Greg McVeigh, Staff Group 1 Alpha, and it is my honor and privilege to be your moderator for today's class, and this class is for attribution. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Don Snyder. Dr. Snyder currently serves as Professor of Army Profession and Ethic in the Strategic Studies Institute, United States Army War College, as well as Senior Fellow in the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic at West Point. Before retiring from the Army in 1990, Dr. Snyder served 3 combat tours in Vietnam as an infantryman. After battalion command in the 32nd Infantry, he served as Chief of Plans for Theater Army in Europe, as Joint Planner for the Army Chief of Staff, as Executive Assistant in the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and on the staff of the National Security Council in the White House. Dr. Snyder's research examines American civil-military relations, the identities and development of the American Army officer, military professions, and professional military ethics. He is the well-respected research director and co-editor of several books. Dr. Snyder holds MA degrees in economics and public policy from the University of Wisconsin and a PhD in public policy from the University of Maryland. Interesting fact about Dr. Snyder is in 1964, while serving in Vietnam, he twice made night jumps at 700 feet with no reserve chute, but with smoke jumping gear to infiltrate the double canopy jungle. And obviously, he survived because he's here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Snyder.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Lord. Sit down. Please sit down. It's a delight to be here. You are an imposing class. Let me congratulate you on being here. It was a couple of decades ago, or in fact longer than that I sat where you were sitting. So I congratulate you on being here. And my challenge is to talk about the most interesting subject I could think about today, and that is you. I've come here to help you understand kind of who you are and where you are in the progression of serving through your years of service to the Republic. And I want to introduce a concept to you, a concept of stewardship. I'm not the only one introducing it. The Army has now accepted stewardship and promulgated it, as you read last night, in new doctrine as a unique form of leadership. And it's the form of leadership that you now should be applying to influence the institution above you as well as those units around you. It's time in your career now that you start thinking as much about leading up as you are about leading out and leading downward. That comes when you pin on your majority, and most of you have done that or will do that before this year is over. So I formed the topic of the discussion in an interrogative. The question straightforward: will Army 2025 be a military profession? And by the end of my presentation, I hope that you will have some indication of the answer. I'm certainly not going to answer it now because that's the story I want to weave and talk to you about as we go through this discussion. So let me go first to what I call leveling the bubbles. I spent some time in a mortar platoon when I was very junior. And I want to level the bubbles so that as I talk to you, you will not be hearing things that I do not intend you to hear. For instance, when I say the word profession, I'm not talking about the Kansas City Chiefs. They're not professionals. Because in that sense, I'm using the word profession contrary to an antonym, amateur. That's not how I'm using the word profession today. That's not how the word profession was used in the ADRP you read last night. I'm talking about professions from the sociology of profession, and a profession is a unique organization for a very unique kind of work, expert work. Not many people in America do expert work, but there are 5 or 6, 7 professions that do expert work. So that's the first thing in leveling the bubbles. When I use the word profession, I'm not talking about those business people that are the Kansas City Chiefs. They're entertainers. They're very good entertainers, and they make a lot of money. We know what that's called. That's called a business. That's not a profession. So that's my first point that I want to make sure that we understand each other. My second point is the Army's not a profession just because it says so. Nobody is a profession because you said so. If that was the case, the truck that I followed down the road the other day would have been an accurate advertisement. And as it happened, it wasn't, because the truck said, "Follow the Pipe Pro." And I looked down below it and it said, "Plumbing Services." So here was a plumber who was advertising a craft, plumbing, as a profession of expert work. Now, a very good way to do some marketing, I might add, but not in the context I'm using it. You are not a profession simply because you declare yourself to be a profession. For 30 years, the Army declared itself to be a profession, 1970 to 2000. But the last time it studied itself as a profession in 1970 was the study of the professionalization of the officer corps during the Vietnam War, done at the War College, commissioned by Chief of Staff Westmoreland. Then for 30 years, the Army never studied itself as a profession. But for 30 years, every time FM1, the Army, came out, it would have an opening paragraph or section on the Army is a profession, da-dum, da-dum, dum. Folks, that was nothing but an intellectually dishonest statement. That was declaratory. You don't get to be a profession by declaring it. Profession is determined by the client. They'll determine if you're a profession or not, and they'll determine by how you're treating them. And we'll come to this in the discussion today, but the only point I want to make up front is it is not the case. Those of you who read Huntington and other theorists of professions, you might have inferred from that literature that once a profession, always a profession. Take that idea out of your mind, expunge it. Not true. Once a profession, always a profession, not true. My third point of leveling the bubbles is professions die. Military professions die. Now, they don't go away. They may still walk around in uniform, but they're not professions, and they're not behaving as professions. So those 3 points I want you to understand. I'm not using the word profession as an antonym to amateur. It is the case that professions can die. And the third point is you're not a profession simply because you stand up and write in a piece of paper somewhere, the Army is a profession, or the American Medical Association is a profession. In fact, the medical association is having a great deal of difficulty with that now, due to the commodification and the rupture of the relationship between the doctor and the patient. So there's much happening in other professions in America, in the competitive professions. So with those 3 caveats, let me go to my topic. I want to talk about stewardship first. Give me the next chart, please. One more. What's a steward? You are stewards of the profession. That's my theme today. You have unique leadership responsibilities as stewards of the profession. Generally, what is a steward? It is a fiduciary responsibility. The reason it's a fiduciary, and you can translate that word to mean moral responsibility, the reason it's that kind of a responsibility is because you are entrusted with something. What do you hold in trust as majors in the United States Army? I'm speaking broadly now. Incidentally, I will be addressing mostly the United States Army because my research is on the United States Army. And I try not to speak about things I haven't researched. But much of what I have researched and we have researched and published in the Army is now being consumed other places. The Navy in particular is really beginning to move out, having established a new Center for Strategic Leadership at the Navy War College. And as much as they abhor doctrine, they're even writing some doctrine now in the Navy. Haven't heard much from the other services yet. So I would say we're probably 6 to 8 years ahead of the other services in this particular field, in this part of the ideation. But back to stewardship. You're entrusted with something. What are you entrusted with? For the Republic, you hold in trust the capability of land power for their security. Nobody else can develop that. Nobody else sells it. Nobody else has it. And right now, the people don't trust anybody else to exercise it on their behalf. So you are stewards of effective land power. In our doctrine, we wrote that there are some characteristics to profession that are absolutely essential. That if the Army is going to be a profession, if your Army is going to be a profession, And why is this important? Because in the last half of my discussion, I'm going to leave the level of analysis of profession, and I'm going to talk about professionals. But we have to establish a profession first before we can talk about professionals. So, we wrote in the doctrine that if these things exist in the Army, honorable service, we defined honorable service as the positive motivation for all members of the profession to abide as they apply their expert knowledge to abide by the Army's ethic. That is honorable service. That's what the client expects. The American people expect you to prosecute war by your ethic because they have approved your ethic. Your ethic is evolving. That's one of your stewardship activities. You're responsible for evolving your ethic over time. I'll come to that later on a couple of specific charts. If we have honorable service, if you have military expertise, that is, having expert knowledge developed into humans to practice, if you have the right military expertise, and if you have the perseverance, the Esprit de Corps, vertically and horizontally, to persevere through adversity, to achieve right and lasting outcome, if you have those three things and a group of leaders who understands what it means to be a steward, and I use the word leader advisedly, non-commissioned officers are stewards, just the same as officers are stewards, just the same as Department of Army civilians are stewards of the Army, because they're all leaders, and stewardship is just one aspect of leadership. If you have these four components, what you will create in the culture is trust. For those of you taking notes, this is the note taker. Trust is the currency of professions. There's no other currency. Authority doesn't cut it. Trust. The client must trust the professional. Professional must trust the other professionals. Foreign professionals want to trust our professionals. Trust is the lifeblood of professions. It's not the currency of a business. It's not the currency of a bureaucracy. There's only three ways of producing things in America: a business, a bureaucracy, or a profession. The other two models do not operate on trust. Professions have one currency: trust. Has to be earned every day. If you have that, and external trust with the American people, internal trust at every level in the hierarchy between leader and led, and in our Army, that's 6 to 8 levels deep some places. And if you're reading your own CASL report and the new CASAP report, you can find out empirically how we're doing with trust. And you know from your own experiences how we're doing with trust. It is always a perishable commodity. But if we have these, just those 5 things, then the Army will be a profession. Now, as you're thinking of stewardship, you took an oath recently. Every time you get promoted, you take one. I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to enter. Office. What goes through what's the mental picture in your mind? Office. It's not a physical space. It's not a rank on your shoulder. What I hope for you to understand today, and what we described as hopefully as clearly as we could in the doctrine, is your office is a moral space, because that is a moral relationship between those who are trusted you with this responsibility and yourself. Next chart, please. So how do we execute stewardship? Let's don't make this more complicated than it is. It's part of leadership. You now execute that through mission command. I've taken the definition of leader command from one of the Army's publications. There's nothing new on the top of this chart. You know that. So I'm talking about stewardship. You understand what it means to be a leader. You understand what it means to execute mission command. And remember, folks, it's well accepted now throughout the Army. We cannot execute mission command if the Army is not a profession. If the Army morphs into a bureaucracy, you will not be able to execute mission command. We'll come back to that later. Notice the bottom chart, the bottom quotation. You're going through a build down now. You're going through a defense reduction. I spent my time in the White House working on arms control for several years, so When they're having massive reductions in arms control, that's called a build down. And when you plan arms control reductions, you have to envision building down the force and doing trade-offs at every lower level of capability. So in my mind, a reduction is a build down. I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. You're going through a defense reduction now. This is my third one. I went through the defense reduction after Vietnam. I went through the defense reduction after the end of the Cold War and the Clinton administration, and I'm now going through my third. They're immensely, intensely bureaucratizing experiences. But notice what we state there. You will find the necessary efficiencies during reductions. But when you're done, only one thing will mark how well you did that. And that will be this: the military effectiveness. Professionals focus on effectiveness. Yes, you must be mindful of efficiency, but do not fall into the trap during the defense reductions that it's all about efficiencies, or Army 2025 will not be effective. Next chart, please. Bureaucracy. Your own Army has studied itself. You have a very good intellectual start on this defense reduction. You've read or will read in some detail the Army's operational concept, the new operational concept, Win in a Complex World. Go ahead, further, one more chart. You will read about the Army's warfighting challenges. There are 20. Now let me take a minute, if you haven't read that document, and explain to you the importance of what you're reading. A warfighting challenge is not just a challenge for the Army in 2015. If you read the document carefully, a lot of historic research went into it, and these warfighting challenges are what they call the first-order, long-term challenges. Your Army was established in 1775, and it has been fighting these 20 things since it was established. The one I want to talk about, your responsibility as a steward, is warfighting challenge number 4, to maintain an agile institutional Army. Now, many of you have been so deep in the operational Army, you tend to think that there's nothing but the operational Army. You only knew them as they. Well, they said. Well, they wrote. Well, this document. No. Well, folks, you're now leading up. You're now going into the institutional Army. You are now them. Maybe not as much as you would like to be yet, but that'll come soon enough, let me assure you. So, how do you have an agile institutional Army? Well, in the risk mitigation portion of the same document, the Army says there are only 3 things that can keep the Army from developing an agile institution. 1, technology. We may not have enough money for the technologies we need. Number 2, resources overall, including people. So, historically, the Army has always rested its developmental periods on the quality of the people and the embedded technology that we put with the people to fight wars. But then they said there's a third challenge that will keep us from being an agile and institutional Army, and that third challenge is bureaucracy. And then they said the DOD is organized. When I talked to General McMaster, I said, why did you say the DOD? Why didn't you say the Department of Defense and the Department of Army? And he got this sly smile on his face and said, well, we just couldn't quite put that in there. But in fact, we all know that the Department of Army is an immensely bureaucratic department, just like the Department of Defense. And all bureaucracies have rules and procedures, and the current processes hinder. They hinder a whole bunch of things, not just the development of technology. One of our greatest areas of hindrance is our military personnel systems, which you folks, I'm sure, have a significant degree of angst about right now. So bureaucracy creates compliance culture. Compliance culture creates non-professional behavior. So a recent research report went out into the Army and found out, one more time, how many corners we're cutting on the moral edge, pencil whipping reports. And I know I'm talking about the culture you just came from and the culture you lived in, but we got to recognize it for what it is. By the corrupting influences of duplicity and deceit, strong words, criticizing not so much the individuals, but the practices and the institutional culture which caused that to happen. So in summary, we got a very sclerotic bureaucracy, and what we want is an agile profession. So how do we get to be that way? Next chart, please. Here's the chronology of the Army. You're part of a venerable institution, just a marvelous institution, founded before the Republic. You existed, you were formed out of the colonial militias who were right under the thumb of the colonial legislators. Don't forget where they came from. Right under the thumb, the colonial militias couldn't have one more barrel of black powder than the legislature said, one more barrel of hardtack, one more person employed. Sound familiar? Sound like Congress today? Legislatures always want to control the military right under their thumb, and that's where you were formed, that's where you came from. So this is your history, 240 years in Army, 126 years of profession, because in this period of time, and this particular institution had a great deal to do with that. Military historians say that the Army was professionalized roughly between 1880 and 1904. And they picked that period because there's two well-documented series of reforms that created the educational system for the officer corps that enabled the Army to have a body of knowledge and a set of schools to teach it that could produce people with expertise. That is a profession. And so they say that the Army was professionalized. The Sherman reforms, he created the Institute for the Advancement of Infantry and Cavalry Application. You now know it as CGSC. Established in 1881, first class graduated 1889. Think of that. That class was here 8 years. We've come a long way. Now, I honestly don't know. I don't know why it took them 8 years, but it was established in 81, and the first class did graduate in 89. And then there were the Root reforms in 1904, which established the War College. And so by that time, we had a level of educational processes that could take expert knowledge written into doctrine, embed it in humans who could practice it independently. Notice the process I just gave you. That is a profession. Folks, you will never find that happen in a bureaucracy anywhere. So if the Army turns into a bureaucracy, we're in deep trouble. That's the process that we must maintain through this defense reduction and into the future. The creation of the right knowledge, the right practice embedded in humans to be practiced discretionarily by those humans. So that's how we got in this, and so let me conclude from this chart. One thing we can conclude from this chart, and one of the central takeaways of this presentation, is you serve in an institution of dual character. If you put a box around the Department of Army and went inside and researched character, you would find two characters. One of bureaucracy, because that's how you were created, a hierarchical bureaucratic department in the federal government, government bureaucracy, just like Department of Interior, Department of Internal Revenue, and yet profession, because in the 1880s we became a profession. And guess what, folks? Ever since that period, at the turn of that century, these two cultures have been knocking heads, and the question of who's going to win is yours. That's what stewards do. That's what leadership is. So if the Army's going to be a profession, you stewards will make it a profession by ensuring that at every level in the organization, the culture of profession dominates the culture of bureaucracy, and not vice versa. And we'll come back to that theme a couple of times. Next chart, please. I've covered this briefly. This is what professions do in contrast to businesses and bureaucracies. A vital service, abstract knowledge, not routine or repetitive, years of study. Folks, I'm describing what a doctor does in this chart. I'm describing what a lawyer does. I'm describing what an Army and Air Force majors do. This is your work. This is what professions do. Experiential learning, you earn the trust of society, and therefore you're granted autonomy. First time I've used that word. If you want to know, folks, if their client considers you to be a profession, where do you look? You look to see how much autonomy they give you, and you watch to see if they're reaching in to take back the autonomy. What's the Congress doing to the United States Army now with respect to commanders' prerogatives for sexual assault and sexual harassment? They're pulling back autonomy. Why? Because we lost their trust. Remember, trust is the currency of profession. They don't trust us. And since they don't trust us, they say, you're going to behave like a bureaucracy? I'll give you the back of the hand and treat you like a bureaucracy. I'll write new rules for you. Folks, this is not new to the Army. What happened after the Aberdeen sex scandals? In the next Defense Authorization Act, the Congress told the Army how to do basic training. They wrote in the act how we would house our basic trainees. How much a bigger affront could that have been to the leadership of the Army? We don't trust you. We're going to tell you how to do your expert work. Immensely embarrassing to the United States Army. My classmate, Denny Reimer, was the chief of staff then. It was crushing for the people leading the Army. And they had to work very hard and very fast to re-earn the trust of the American people and their elected representatives. And you folks are going to have to do exactly the same thing right now. You've already got to start, but you've got a long way to go, at least from the data that I look at. So that's what professions do. Now, let's look at a contrast between professions and bureaucracy. Next chart. This is probably the most important chart in this presentation. I could almost do this whole presentation from one chart. On this side are the characteristics of profession. On this side are the characteristics of bureaucracy. Before I go down the chart, I want to ask you, as we go through this, to think about the unit you just left. Which was it? What culture dominated? Was your unit practicing expert knowledge or just doing routine things? Did people there accept lifelong learning applied to new situations? Did humans do the practice, or do you do work by processes? Notice, folks, bureaucracies do their work by processes. The Army does its work by leaders, by leadership, at every level. Every soldier is a leader. If they do nothing more than lead themselves, that's where you start with leadership. So on this side, practice by process, practice by humans. Measure effectiveness, measure efficiency. Trust relationship, no trust relationship, it's just the public market. No autonomy granted. We develop a worldview. I don't know how much you know about worldviews, but psychologists tell us we all have a worldview. It's like you have a set of glasses. And when you put on your glasses, all of reality is filtered through these set of glasses when I see it. And that's how I interpret it initially, at least until I go through the process of applying critical reasoning and critical thinking, etc. And you do develop a worldview. You have a very particular worldview about war and violence and what is good and what is right and what is just and why you're willing to sacrifice to protect those things. So it not only is a worldview, it is a moral worldview. And it's reflected down here in the institutional ethos which you self-police. Or if you don't self-police, then you bureaucratize the institution. And that's where we are with sexual assault and sexual harassment. We know what the solution to that is. It's us. It's you. It's not them. Not some new policy, and certainly not Congress writing new legislation. The solution to the problem is leadership, stewardship of the profession. I'm very encouraged by the new Not in My Squad campaign. The Non-Commissioned Officer Corps has taken on this issue full bore. And I'm very anxious to see what they're going to be able to do with it. And I'm also rather sanguine about the outcome. We don't know, but I'm sanguine. You develop a worldview. Down here we have an ethic. It's self-policed. Intrinsic motivations here. Extrinsic over here. This is when we really trip ourselves up on. Because the Army routinely, all the time, uses a lot of extrinsic motivators, particularly in our personnel systems. And the reason we do that, we can go into in Q&A. There are some good reasons for doing it, but mostly we do it because that's the way the Congress likes it. That's one way they can control us. What we're really after is the intrinsic motivations. You might ask yourself as we're going through this and you're going through this module on the ethic, what are your personal motivations? What are your satisfactions? The next job? The next rank? The next assignment? A soldier well developed. A soldier's family healed. A soldier with moral injury repaired. What are your motivations? Where do you derive your satisfactions? See, professionals follow calling. These people have a job. If you're here just because you have a job, then may I make a polite suggestion? Leave. The services don't need you. We do not need people who think they are professionals and yet are working as if they had a job. We're not after jobbers. We want people who have a calling. In the Latin, vocare, what does it mean? To follow a calling, what does it say? Basically, it says one thing. It says, my work is immensely more important than I am. If you didn't think your work was more important than you are, then why would you go die for someone? And yet many of you bear the wounds that kept you from dying. So see, we're in a unique business. We're in a really unique business as a profession. And it is a calling. And that is an intrinsic motivation. And that's what we have to preserve as we go through this defense reduction when there are so much tendencies to attempt to bureaucratize us and to morph us into something that we aren't and don't want to be. So, I still think that's one of the most important charts here, but we'll move on. Next chart.